Indu and Omkar arrive at a fragrant apricot orchard, leaving the noise of the city behind for the stillness of the valley. Between the scent of ripening fruit and the rhythmic simmer of ancestral spices, they find their restless minds beginning to quiet. It is a journey toward deep tranquility and shared connection. Listen as the family drifts together into a state of warm, heavy serenity. The welcome of the valley. The taxi arrived in a violent burst of yellow dust that clung to the damp edges of the road, coughing a final cloud of grit into the air before the engine died with a shudder. Jagdish Thapa stood at the orchard gate, his feet planted firmly in the loam, rubbing his thumb against his palm in a slow, rhythmic circle. He didn't move to meet the car. He simply waited, smelling the static crackle of the receding storm and the heavy, saccharine weight of ripening apricots that pressed against the skin of the valley. The air was thick enough to chew, tasting of crushed stone and nectar, a stillness so profound it seemed to swallow the sound of the slamming car doors. Indu stepped out first. Her movements were jerky, a series of sharp angles that sliced through the soft morning light. She didn't look at the mountains first, she watched her palm. Her fingers flew across the glass of her phone, a frantic search for a signal that the valley had long ago decided to withhold. She adjusted her glasses with a quick, precise flick of her finger, the plastic frames clicking against her temple. When she finally looked up, her eyes were narrow, scanning the horizon as if searching for a deadline. "Papa," she said, her voice crisp and clipped, the tone of a woman who had just stepped out of a boardroom and expected a status report. She didn't hug him immediately. Instead, she stood there, the rigidity of her shoulders forming a straight line that refused to yield to the slope of the land. The driver said the last 3 kilometers were nearly impassable. "We nearly lost an hour to a landslide that wasn't even on the map. I've already mapped out the route for the return trip to avoid the gorge, but we'll need to coordinate the timing with the local transport schedule." Omkar followed her, hauling a suitcase that looked too heavy for the terrain. He was already speaking, his voice a rapid-fire cadence that sounded like a ticker-tape machine. He didn't wait for a response from his father before launching into a technical critique of the journey. "It's a logistical nightmare, Papa. Truly. The road gradient is completely inefficient. They've built the switchbacks at angles that defy basic engineering logic. I was calculating the fuel consumption versus the distance covered, and it's a net loss. If the village council just implemented a basic grading system or a streamlined transit hub at the base of the hill, they could cut the ascent time by 20%. Jagdish didn't answer. He didn't offer a critique of the roads or a confirmation of their arrival. Instead, he let out a slow, melodic hum, a sound that vibrated in the back of his throat and seemed to blend with the distant drone of bees. He raised a weathered hand, gesturing not toward the house, but toward the canopy of the orchard. He wanted them to smell it. The scent of the apricots, which had reached that precarious peak where the fruit is almost too sweet to be edible, hovering on the edge of fermentation. "The air is heavy today," Jagdish said, his voice a soft rasp, like wind moving through dry leaves. "Listen to the trees. They are breathing." Indu blinked, her brow furrowing. She shifted her weight, her leather loafers clicking on a stray stone. "That's lovely, Papa, but we really should get the luggage inside. I've made a rough itinerary for the weekend. I thought we could spend tomorrow morning organizing the pantry and then perhaps sit down to discuss the family records. If we start now, we can have the bulk of the sorting done by Saturday evening, which leaves Sunday for the actual cooking." She stepped forward to lead the way, her pace brisk, her mind already 3 steps ahead of her feet. She was a woman moving through a world of schedules and spreadsheets, treating the valley as a series of tasks to be completed. Jagdish reached out and gently caught her elbow, stopping her mid-stride. The sudden halt caused Indu to twitch, her shoulders jerking upward. She studied his hand, then at his face, her expression one of genuine confusion, as if she had encountered a glitch in a program. "Look here," Jagdish whispered. He led her 2 steps to the left, toward an old tree with a trunk twisted like a piece of weathered rope. He pointed to a precise, scarred junction where a younger branch had been fused to the older wood. "This is a graft from the 1954 harvest. Your grandfather brought the scion from the lower valley. It took 3 years of patience, 3 years of waiting for the sap to recognize the new guest before it finally took. If you rush the graft, the tree rejects it. It pushes the stranger away." He fell silent then. The silence wasn't a silence for breath, it was a destination. He stood there, staring at the scar in the bark, his thumb returning to the slow rub against his palm. Indu stood beside him, her body vibrating with a suppressed urgency. She glanced at her watch, then at Omkar, then back to the tree. The silence stretched, expanding until it felt like a physical weight. To Indu, the silence was a void that needed to be filled with a plan. To Jagdish, it was the only part of the conversation that mattered. Omkar, meanwhile, had stopped his talking, but hadn't found the stillness. He stood with his suitcase beside him, his fingers tapping a rapid 4/4 beat against the hard plastic shell. Tap, 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 tap. He was counting the seconds, his internal clock ticking in synchronization with the digital world he had left behind. He watched the graft his father was admiring, and saw not a story of patience, but a botanical inefficiency. He wanted to ask about the yield per branch, about the soil pH, about the optimization of the watering cycle, but the heavy, honeyed scent of the air seemed to clog his throat, slowing his rhythm. "We can't just stand here, can we?" Omkar asked, though his voice had lost some of its velocity. He studied his father, seeing the deep creases around the old man's eyes and the way he seemed to merge with the landscape, as if he were just another ancient root in the soil. "We can," Jagdish replied, his voice trailing off into another long, drifting silence. He didn't look at them. He was listening to the wind shift through the leaves, a sound that whispered of coming rain and old memories. They began the walk toward the cottage, a small stone structure tucked behind a curtain of flowering shrubs. The contrast was stark. The heavy, rhythmic thud of Indu's city shoes and the metal-sharp rattle of Omkar's suitcase clashing against the soft, damp earth. They moved like intruders in a cathedral, their noise jarring against the velvet quiet of the valley. Indu continued to mutter about the timeline, her voice softening but the urgency remaining, a thin wire of tension that she carried in her neck. As they reached the wooden porch, the air suddenly shifted. From across the valley, the distant melodic chime of temple bells began to echo. It wasn't a single sound, but a ripple of bronze tones that vibrated through the valley, bouncing off the granite peaks and rolling over the apricot trees in a slow, sweeping wave. The sound was physical. It landed on their skin like a cool mist. Omkar stopped mid-sentence, his finger frozen mid-tap on his suitcase. He opened his mouth to speak, but the resonance of the bells seemed to pull the words right out of him. For the first time since he had stepped out of the taxi, he was silent. The three of them stood on the porch, the city dwellers and the schoolmaster, suspended in a moment where the only thing that existed was the fading vibration of the bronze and the scent of fruit waiting to fall. Shedding the corporate skin. The scent of ripening apricots didn't drift into the room, it invaded. A thick, cloying sweetness. It curled around the bedposts and settled over Indu's skin like a damp sheet. She jolted awake to a ceiling of rough-hewn cedar beams. For a moment, the disorientation was absolute. There was no hum of air conditioning, no city sirens, no rhythmic ticking of a digital clock. There was only the gold-weighted silence of the valley, a physical pressure resting on her chest. Her hand swept across the bedside table for her phone. Her fingers met cold glass, but when she pressed the wake button, the screen remained an obsidian void. Dead. She scanned for the white coil of her charger, but the space was empty. Panic flared, not because she missed her contacts, but because she had no way to measure time. She was adrift in a place where the only clock was the shifting slant of light across the floorboards. She felt the familiar tightening in her neck, the phantom tension of a missed deadline. She sat up, the cotton sheets rustling. Through the open window, the orchard was a blur of deep greens and soft oranges, the air shimmering with heat and crushed fruit. She reached to push her glasses higher on her nose, a reflex from 1,000 boardroom meetings, but her hand stopped. She studied the dead phone and felt a fluttering hollowness in her stomach. It was the sensation of being completely unreachable, a feeling that should have been terrifying, but instead felt like a slow leak in a pressurized vessel. "The light is right." A voice drifted from the porch, soft and raspy as wind through dry leaves. Indu walked to the door, her movements jerky, her mind still trying to calculate a schedule for a day without coordinates. Jagdish stood there, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the granite peaks of the Himalayas cut a jagged line against a bruised sky. He didn't ask if she was ready. He simply gestured toward the trees. "Come," he said. "The wind is speaking the morning language." They stepped into the dew-heavy grass. Indu tried to keep pace, but Jagdish didn't walk so much as drift. His stride was meditative, forcing her to consciously shorten her steps. When she asked about the logistics of the village visit, Jagdish responded with silence. He would stop mid-sentence to watch a beetle traverse a root or inhale a cluster of blossoms. Each silence was a hurdle. Indu felt compelled to jump, but as the minutes stretched, the gaps acted as a sedative. She found herself matching her breathing to the slow cadence of his voice, the edges of her urgency beginning to fray. "Listen," Jagdish whispered beneath a canopy of low-hanging branches. "Don't hear the wind. Listen to what it is carrying." Indu closed her eyes. At first, she heard only the roar of her internal monologue, pending emails, the ghost of a calendar alert. But as she stayed still, the noise receded. She heard the metal sharp clink of a goat bell and the dry hiss of leaves. Beneath the apricots lay a scent of pine needles and cold stone. She reached out and touched a ripening fruit. The skin was fuzzy, warm, and yielding. For several minutes, she simply stood there and realized she had forgotten to adjust her glasses. Her shoulders dropped an inch. The tension in her neck shifted from a sharp wire to a dull hum. "I've mapped it out," a voice cut through the stillness. Omkar appeared from the cottage, his tablet clutched like a shield. He was marching, eyes scanning a glowing spreadsheet. "If we optimize the morning for the orchard walk and schedule the village visit for 2:30 p.m., we can maximize downtime before the evening meal. I've accounted for transit times and a 20-minute buffer. We can hit the main landmarks in a 4-hour block." Indu looked at her brother, then her father. Omkar's voice was a staccato burst, a city frequency broadcasting in a valley of low hums. He was trying to solve the orchard as if it were a bug in a piece of code, his fingers tapping a rapid 4/4 beat against the tablet. He was vibrating with the need for efficiency, blind to the way the light filtered through the leaves in golden, shifting coins. Jagdish didn't argue. He simply stopped talking. He turned his head and stared at a distant, snow-capped peak with profound, vacant curiosity. He remained perfectly still for a full minute. Omkar stopped mid-sentence. "I mean, we could adjust the buffer to 15 minutes if we start now." "Dad, are you listening? The logic holds up, right?" Jagdish continued to stare at the mountain. The silence became an active participant in the conversation, a mirror reflecting Omkar's frantic energy back at him until the speed of his voice sounded absurd. Slowly, the tapping of Omkar's fingers ceased. His confidence leaked out until he was left standing in the middle of the path, looking suddenly small against the backdrop of the ancient trees. Indu felt a bubbling warmth in her chest. She watched her father's patience outplay her brother's logic without a single word. It was a quiet victory, a slow-motion defeat of the corporate mind. She felt the weight of the city feeling less like a skin and more like a garment she could simply unbutton and leave behind. They drifted toward the perimeter of the orchard, where the manicured rows gave way to a tangled edge of brambles and slate-gray rocks. Jagdish wandered ahead to examine a graft, leaving Indu to navigate the uneven soil. As she stepped over a protruding root, her shoe caught on something hard and half-buried. She knelt, brushing away the damp earth. It was a notebook, bound in leather the color of old tobacco, its edges frayed. As she pried it open, a puff of dust rose, carrying a scent that made her heart stutter, a heady mixture of cinnamon, scorched sugar, and wood smoke. The pages were stained with yellowed rings of oil and looping, faded script. It wasn't a diary, but a ledger of ingredients and timings, some crossed out with aggressive ink, others circled with obsessive care. Beside a sketch of an apricot, a note read, "The secret is not in the heat, but in the waiting." Indu looked up, but her father was already drifting further into the trees, his silhouette blurring into the green. She looked back at the book, the scent of wood smoke clinging to her skin, and felt a sudden sharp prickle of curiosity that had nothing to do with a schedule. The rhythm of the pot. Omkar had already colonized the kitchen by 10 in the morning. He stood over the heavy slate countertop, his knife moving in a blur of surgical precision, reducing a pile of ginger and garlic into identical, translucent cubes. He wasn't just cooking, he was executing a process. Beside him, a digital probe thermometer was skewed into a metal tang pot, its LCD screen flashing a precise neon green temperature. He had arranged his mise en place with the rigidity of a motherboard, small glass bowls aligned in a perfect row, the spices measured to the milligram in a handheld scale he had brought from the city. Jagdish entered the room with a step that barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the shafts of morning light. He watched his son for a moment, noting the way Omkar's shoulders were hunched, his jaw locked in a state of high-frequency tension. The kitchen smelled of raw sulfur and the sharp, sharp tang of the new knife. Jagdish reached out and, with a slow, deliberate motion, slid the digital thermometer away from the pot. He didn't set it down, he simply moved it to the far edge of the counter, where it looked like a stranded piece of plastic debris on a shoreline of stone. "The heat is a conversation, Omkar," Jagdish said, his voice a soft rasp like wind through dry leaves. "You cannot hear it if you are reading a screen." Omkar stopped mid-slice, the knife hovering a fraction of an inch above the board. He watched the thermometer, and then at his father, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and genuine alarm. He began to tap his index finger against the slate, a rapid 4/4 beat that echoed the ticking of a clock. "Dad, intuitive cooking is just a euphemism for a lack of data. If we want the reduction to be consistent with the notes Indu found, we need a controlled thermal environment. A variance of 5 degrees can change the viscosity of the apricot puree entirely. It's basic chemistry." Jagdish didn't argue. He simply placed his open palm a few inches above the surface of the simmering liquid, feeling the humidity brush against his skin. He rubbed his thumb against his palm, a slow, rhythmic gesture of memory. Chemistry is for the laboratory. In this house, we cook by the breath of the fire. The pot tells you when it is ready. You just have to stop talking long enough to listen. Omkar's finger-tapping accelerated. The logic of the city, the world of sprints, KPIs, and optimized workflows was screaming inside him. To him, his father's approach wasn't meditative, it was inefficient. It was a waste of time, and time was the only currency he knew how to spend. He felt a surge of restlessness, a need to reclaim the pace of the room. While Jagdish drifted toward the window to watch a blue jay land on the sill, Omkar reached for the dial of the gas stove. He twisted it sharply to the right, cranking the flame to a roar. He wanted to force the reduction, to skip the tedious middle and arrive at the result through sheer intensity. For 3 minutes, the pot hissed violently. The liquid surged, bubbling over the sides in a frantic, frothy rush. Then the smell changed. The sweet, deep scent of the fruit vanished, replaced instantly by a sharp, sharp bitterness. The sauce broke. The oil separated from the solids in a greasy, shimmering slick, and the apricot puree curdled into unsightly, burnt clumps. The efficiency he had sought had acted as a catalyst for failure. Omkar froze. He stared at the ruined mixture, his hand still gripping the dial. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the dying hiss of the foam hitting the burner. He expected a lecture on patience or a sigh of disappointment. Instead, Jagdish simply stepped forward and picked up a heavy wooden spoon, its handle smoothed by decades of grip. Without a word, Jagdish began to stir. He didn't try to fix the break with haste. He moved the spoon in a slow, wide, circular motion, a rhythmic orbit that seemed to pull the air into the pot. He didn't look at the stove. He looked through the steam, his eyes distant, as if he were remembering the exact movement of a ghost. The motion was hypnotic, a steady, grounding loop that began to overwrite the frantic energy Omkar had injected into the room. Omkar watched the bubbles. As the heat settled, the popping sound changed. It was no longer a frantic sizzle, but a low-frequency, rhythmic thrum, a slow, wet plip-plop that echoed the heartbeat of the house. He found his own breathing involuntarily syncing with the sound. The jagged edges of his thoughts began to soften. He studied his own hand and realized his finger had stopped tapping. The silence of the mountain, which he had fought since arriving, finally breached the walls of his mind. "The secret is not in the heat," Omkar whispered, echoing the line Indu had read from the notebook. "But in the waiting," Jagdish finished, his voice a melodic hum. He held out the wooden spoon, offering it like a baton. Omkar took the spoon. He didn't try to optimize the angle or increase the speed. He simply stepped into his father's rhythm, mirroring the slow, circular orbit. As he stirred, the scent began to shift again. The acridity faded, replaced by a deep, grounding aroma of cinnamon and charred apricot, a scent that felt less like a smell and more like a memory of a place he had never been. It was the scent of the leather notebook, of old tobacco and scorched sugar, manifesting in the steam. He felt a strange, heavy warmth settle in his chest, a feeling of belonging that didn't require a schedule to justify it. They stood there in a shared silence for a long time, the only sound the rhythmic glide of wood against metal tang. The kitchen had become a sanctuary of slow motion, the city's urgency feeling like a dream from which he had finally woken. Omkar felt his shoulders drop, his grip on the spoon loosening until he was no longer controlling the pot, but simply accompanying it. Just as the sauce thickened into a glossy mahogany glaze, a soft, hesitant knock sounded at the heavy oak door. It was a sound so slight it almost blended with the wind. Jagdish stepped back, gesturing for Omkar to keep the rhythm of the stir. Jagdish opened the door to reveal a young man standing on the threshold. He was thin, with a pale complexion and a gaze that seemed to be measuring the light rather than looking at the person in front of him. He clutched a charcoal-smudged sketchbook to his chest, his head tilted slightly to the side as he observed the way the shadows of the apricot trees fell across the porch. He looked as though he were afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the stillness of the valley. "I'm sorry to intrude," the stranger said, his voice barely a whisper, trailing off into a long pause. "I'm Rohan, a distant cousin. I was told this was a place where one could find a quiet corner to sketch." Jagdish smiled, a slow unfolding of wrinkles around his eyes. He didn't ask for credentials or a reason for the visit. He simply stepped aside, inviting the silence of the stranger into the warmth of the house. The secret of absolute silence. The heavy oak door had barely clicked shut behind Rohan when the kitchen air shifted, displaced by a presence that felt less like a person entering a room and more like a warm blanket being draped over the shoulders of everyone inside. Chandra Devi did not announce herself with a greeting, she simply arrived, her footsteps muffled by the woven rugs, carrying a small, hand-carved wooden box that smelled faintly of camphor and dried rose petals. She stood for a moment in the center of the room, her deep, resonant voice cutting through the lingering tension of the morning like a low-frequency bell. "You have the heat right, Jagdish, but you are treating the pot like a clock," Chandra said, her voice humming with a comfort that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. She didn't look at the stove immediately. Instead, she fixed on the people. Her gaze lingered on Omkar, who was still clutching the wooden spoon with a tentative grip, and then on Indu, who stood by the table, her fingers twitching toward the pocket where her phone lived. Chandra's presence was an anchor, pulling the frantic energy of the city dwellers down into the slow, cool earth of the valley. In the corner, Rohan had already found his sanctuary. He didn't speak or offer a formal introduction. He simply leaned against the lime-washed wall, his thin frame nearly disappearing into the shadows. He opened his sketchbook with a soft, dry rasp of paper. His head tilted slightly to the side as he studied the geometry of the scene, the way the steam curled in a lazy spiral toward the rafters, the slope of Jagdish's shoulders, and the cautious curiosity on the faces of the siblings. His pencil began to move in soft, graphite strokes, capturing not the likeness of the people, but the weight of the silence they were beginning to inhabit. Chandra Devi stepped toward the stove, her hand moving in a slow, circular motion in the air, as if she were stirring an invisible pot before she ever touched the real one. She watched the mahogany glaze of the apricot reduction and frowned, though there was no malice in it, only the strictness of a keeper of secrets. "The leather notebook is a map, not the destination," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "It tells you how to prepare the earth, but it cannot tell you when the seed has broken the surface. There is a final step, a closing note to this melody, that cannot be written in ink. It cannot be taught through a recipe or an instruction manual. It can only be felt when the mind stops trying to arrive and simply decides to be." Indu felt a familiar, jagged spike of anxiety. Her mind, conditioned by a decade of quarterly reviews and urgent deliverables, instinctively sought the how and the when. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, intending to check the time or perhaps a missed email. But as she laid the device face down on the rustic wooden table, a small notification light began to blink. A steady, rhythmic blue pulse. In the city, that light would have been a command, a siren calling her back to the noise of 1,000 competing priorities. She studied the blinking light, then at the steady, patient expression on her father's face, and then at Chandra. Slowly, with a deliberation that felt like peeling off a heavy, restrictive skin, Indu pushed the phone further away. She didn't turn it off. That would be too aggressive, too much of a statement. But she ignored it. She watched the blue light blink, and for the first time in years, she decided that the world could wait until the sauce was finished. She felt a strange lightness in her chest, a loosening of a knot she hadn't realized she'd been tying every morning since she left the mountains. What happens if I just stop? The thought drifted through her mind, sudden and sharp. If I stop measuring the gaps between the seconds, if I stop treating my life as a series of tasks to be optimized, will there be anything left of me? I have spent so long being the woman who manages the chaos that I've forgotten how to exist in the stillness. I am terrified that if I truly let go, I will find that I am hollow, a shell constructed of spreadsheets and deadlines. But looking at my father, looking at the way he breathes with the house, I wonder if the hollowness is actually the space where the peace is supposed to live. Chandra Devi noticed the shift in Indu's posture. The woman's shoulders dropped an inch, then 2. The tension in her jaw vanished. Chandra turned back to the pot and raised a hand, a silent command for absolute stillness. "Now," Chandra whispered, "we enter the patient's attunement. No one speaks, no one moves to check the time. You must synchronize, not with each other, but with the breath of the fruit." They formed a loose circle around the stove. The kitchen, which had been a place of activity and debate, transformed into a temple of low-frequency sound. The only noise was the rhythmic, viscous bubble of the thick sauce, a slow, heavy gluck-gluck that sounded like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. The scent had evolved again, moving past the cinnamon and char into something floral and ancient, a smell that suggested deep roots and cold winters. Indu closed her eyes. At first, the silence felt oppressive, a vacuum that her mind tried to fill with mental to-do lists. But then she focused on the steam. She felt the warmth of it on her cheeks and the dampness of it in her nostrils. She began to time her inhalation to the rise of a bubble, and her exhalation to its collapse. Beside her, she could hear Omkar's breathing slowing down, his rhythmic finger-tapping finally ceasing as he surrendered his need for precision to the organic pulse of the pot. Jagdish stood beside them, his thumb rubbing his palm in a slow, meditative cycle. He wasn't leading them, he was simply existing alongside them, a living testament to the stillness they were chasing. The synchronization felt like a physical cord drawing them together, a shared frequency that erased the distance between the corporate executive, the software engineer, and the retired schoolmaster. In the corner, Rohan's pencil moved in perfect harmony with the group. He wasn't sketching the figures anymore, he was sketching the atmosphere, the invisible lines of tension and release. He tilted his head, his eyes darting between the bubbling sauce and the closed eyes of the Thapa family, capturing the exact moment where the individual egos dissolved into a collective waiting. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. The distinction had ceased to matter. The blinking blue light of Indu's phone had likely stopped, or perhaps it was still there, a forgotten relic of another dimension. The air in the kitchen felt thick, saturated with a quietude so profound it felt tangible, like a velvet curtain draped over the room. Just as the synchronization reached a peak, when the breathing of the three adults and the bubbling of the pot became a single, unified rhythm, Chandra Devi leaned in. She didn't break the silence with a shout, but with a whisper that seemed to glide through the air, intended only for those who had truly learned how to listen. "Now," she breathed, her voice a secret shared between the fire and the fruit. "Only now, when the silence is absolute and the heart is still, you add the crushed petals of the winter bloom apricot. Not a grain more, not a second sooner." She reached into her wooden box and produced a small pinch of iridescent, dried petals, their color a ghost of a pale violet. As she held them over the mahogany glaze, the group held their breath, the tension shifting from a desire for efficiency to a reverence for the moment of completion. Hold in repose. The pot was too heavy for one person to carry without a tilt, so Omkar and Indu took it together, their grip synchronized in a way that had nothing to do with the shared calendar. They moved slowly, the mahogany glaze within the vessel shifting like liquid silk, releasing a scent that was no longer just fruit and sugar, but something deeper, the smell of old earth, dried petals, and the patience of a dozen generations. As they stepped from the cool shadows of the kitchen into the orchard, the light hit them in a sudden, thick wash of honey and soft lavender. The sun was dipping behind the jagged spine of the mountains, stretching the shadows of the apricot trees into long, thin fingers that seemed to reach for the house. Chandra Devi had already laid out the hand-woven mats beneath the oldest tree, where the roots formed a natural, undulating bench. The mats were coarse, smelling of sun-dried grass and old wool. Jagdish followed behind his children, his pace unhurried, his thumb rhythmically tracing the line of his palm. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. He simply watched the way Indu's shoulders had finally dropped, no longer braced for a phone call that would never come, and how Omkar's fingers had stopped their frantic 4/4 tapping. The air was cooling rapidly, the sharp mountain chill beginning to bite at the edges of the golden warmth, making the rising steam from the pot look like a living thing, a white ghost dancing between them. They sat in a circle, the pot placed in the center. Indu reached for a wooden spoon, her movements deliberate. She dipped it into the glaze, lifting a small, shimmering dollop that clung to the wood. As she tasted it, she didn't just taste the apricot, she tasted the silence of the afternoon, the weight of the waiting, and the iridescent violet of the petals. It was a flavor that felt like a homecoming, a slow-motion revelation that made the corporate world she had left behind seem like a frantic, blurred movie playing at double speed. She waited for the phantom itch, the habitual electric pull to reach into her pocket and check the urgency of her inbox, but the itch was gone. In its place was a hollow, peaceful space, a quietude that felt heavier and more permanent than any schedule she had ever managed. "It tastes like the air before the first rain," Omkar whispered. He didn't look at the pot, but at the horizon, his voice stripped of its usual rhythmic urgency. He had spent his life optimizing systems, trying to shave seconds off a process, but as he sat there, the very idea of efficiency felt absurd. Why would anyone want to reach the end of a moment faster when the moment itself was the destination? He leaned back on his elbows, his gaze drifting toward the canopy of the apricot trees, where the last of the light was catching the underside of the leaves, turning them into shards of translucent gold. Beside them, Rohan had remained a shadow, his presence as light as the graphite on his paper. He had been sketching in a fever of quiet concentration, his head tilted to the side, capturing the way the light died in increments. After a long silence, he shifted, his movement tentative, as if he were afraid to break the spell. He didn't speak at first, he simply extended his sketchbook toward the center of the circle. The drawing was a charcoal study of the three of them in the kitchen, Jagdish, Indu, and Omkar, leaning over the pot. He hadn't captured their faces with precision, but he had captured the lean of their bodies, the shared frequency of their breath, and the invisible cord of attention that had bound them together. They looked like three parts of a single machine, a machine designed for nothing but stillness. Jagdish took the book, his fingers grazing the rough paper. He studied the image, then at his children. He saw the urban noise, the jagged edges of city stress, and the frantic hum of ambition had been replaced by a reflected stillness in their eyes. It was the look of people who had forgotten how to hurry. He felt a heavy, warm serenity settle in his chest, a feeling so dense it almost felt like grief, though it was the opposite. It was the grief of a long-awaited return. He rubbed his thumb against his palm, a slow, meditative cycle, acknowledging the victory of the slow over the fast. As the conversation died down, it didn't leave a void, but a comfort. The silence was no longer something to be filled, it was a blanket. In the distance, the temple bells began to chime, a fading, metal-sharp melody that drifted through the valley, marking the transition from the golden hour to the deep, velvet blue of the mountain twilight. The sound was thin and lonely, yet it anchored them to the earth, reminding them that the world continued to turn, even if they had chosen to step off the wheel for a while. Indu leaned her head back against the rough bark of the apricot tree. She felt a sudden, sharp awareness of the cost of this peace. To be here, in this state of absolute repose, was to be completely out of step with the world she had spent 15 years building. She was a ghost in her own professional life, a glitch in the corporate machinery. The thought should have panicked her. It should have sent her racing back to the house to find a signal. Instead, she felt a strange, shimmering contentment in the loss. The distance between her current self and her city self felt like a canyon, and she found she was perfectly happy to let the bridge collapse. "I think I've forgotten how to be that person," Indu said, her voice now a low, breathy register that blended into the rustle of the leaves. She didn't specify which person, but the weight of the statement hung in the air, a confession of a voluntary surrender. Omkar didn't answer with a solution or a logical counterpoint. He simply shifted closer to her, his shoulder brushing hers, a rare gesture of physical vulnerability. The group drifted together, the boundaries of their individual egos softening in the fading light. The scent of the apricot trees grew stronger as the dew began to settle, a thick, floral musk that acted as a sedative, pulling at their eyelids. One by one, the energy left them. It wasn't the exhaustion of hard labor, but the heavy, warm sleep of the satisfied. Jagdish felt his chin sink toward his chest, his breathing syncing with the slow rhythm of the forest. Indu felt her consciousness fraying at the edges, the velvet blue of the sky merging with the darkness of the orchard. They leaned against one another, a tangle of limbs and wool blankets, drifting into a deep, dreamless slumber beneath the protective canopy of the ancestral trees. Just as the last sliver of light vanished behind the peaks and the first star pierced the indigo veil, a soft footfall crunched on the dried leaves nearby. A voice, thin and hesitant, broke the silence of the sleeping family. "I found the other half of the notebook," Rohan whispered to the stillness.